Welcome to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and, of course, a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. I'm Elizabeth Townsend Guard. I'm a law professor at Tulane University, and I just want to quilt. So this past week, we had a bit of controversy on our Facebook site when people were trying to understand the email and the postings from Joann's Fabrics about tariffs. So I turned to the person I knew who would know what this was all about, which is Professor David Gantz from Arizona, who was my mentor and who is the most amazing trade law professor and trade law lawyer I've ever met. So once I became a full professor, the dean asked me if what I was going to do for my next project, and I said I wanted to do quilting and copyright, and he thought that was weird, but they were okay with it and bought me sewing machines, and it turned out to be this humongous, serious, big project that's like $5 billion industry that no one's really looked at in terms of the role of law in the creative process. And so it's been going about a year. And I started a podcast as I started interviewing people, and we've had over 60,000 downloads in 6 months. And
now, who's your audience?
My audience are quilters, and the quilt industry. So all kinds of people quilt. And David asked how big the industry is. 8 to 10 million quilters. So it's a good size industry. And
who sells them fabric and supplies?
Good. Well, it's kind of interesting. So sometimes mostly they're local quilt shops that are independent quilt shops. So it's strange that there's no national quilt shops. They're all local and small and interesting and independent. And then there's the big box stores. So there's Joanns and there's Walmart and Hobby Lobby. And those, and so there's kind of this almost stigma that you don't shop there, but people do. So it's kind of this battle between like Joann's and Hobby Lobby versus the small local quilt shops that can't compete with the prices. So that's interesting, right? And so most of the material is made in, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think in Japan and Korea, not in China. So China fabric is made in China, but it's not the good fabric, right? That's how it's. But Joann's put out this thing saying that the tariffs are going to raise the prices, and you have to sign these petitions, and all of the quilters got really confused and thought it was super political and didn't know really how to respond to it. And so I thought maybe we would talk a little bit about you, and I wrote to you, and I thought maybe we could just talk about what's happening exactly, and then so that people can understand it a little bit more about why suddenly they're talking about tariffs when they're quilters.
Yeah, well, if the stuff isn't coming from China, the impact so far, at least from anything the administration has done, is going to be pretty limited, I think.
Yeah.
The tariffs on steel and aluminum that were imposed, a couple of months ago, affect Japan. They affect the European Union. They affect Canada. They affect Mexico. What were the other sources you were mentioning? Indonesia?
Korea, I think. South Korea.
They affect Korea, but only marginally, because neither Korea nor Japan have gotten themselves into retaliation and counter-retaliation the way things are going with China. So I think it's probably pretty clear that if your group are importing fabric from Korea or from Japan, that at least at present there really is no significant risk. Now, you never know what this administration is going to do. If you believe that their interest is protectionism of every product line, not just steel and aluminum, and the threat to autos and auto parts, which would be enormous if you assume that they eventually want to go beyond that and they basically want to close off all sorts of manufacturing of even things that haven't really been very competitive in the U.S. for years, like textile fabrics and footwear and things like that, then you need to worry. But you don't need to worry this year or next year unless you're bringing in goods from China. In that case, it's likely to be much more immediate if the president goes ahead with additional tariffs. They've just been upping the ante every month or so. But by and large, as we have a bilateral free trade agreement with Korea. I suspect most of the products that are coming in that are of interest to quilters are coming in at very low tariffs or zero tariffs by now. And there's no trade agreement with Japan, but again, trade relations are pretty friendly, except some of the friction over the steel and the aluminum stuff. And the countries are talking about a free trade agreement, which I think is a very long way off. But by and large, I think the status quo for both Korea and Japan is much more likely than any changes.
Okay, so
in the foreseeable future.
Yes. Okay. So let's just in case people are listening and they don't understand what we're talking about, can you just give us a basic understanding of what a tariff is? Because some listening may not understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, tariff's a tax. It's a tax on imports. It may be imposed to protect domestic producers, as it often is in the textile and apparel industry. It may be imposed to raise revenue, although it's not a major revenue source in developed countries. It certainly is in developing countries, and basically it's a tax that when you import goods, you pay it at the border. Pretty much every country in the world, except Hong Kong and Singapore, has significant tariffs on a lot of their imports. U.S. tariffs overall average about 3.5%, but some on textiles and clothing are much, much higher than that, so it's really hard to know without knowing the exact product what the tariff is. Typically, the tariff rate for, say, particular textile fabric is the same whether it comes from Korea or China or Japan or the European Union or anywhere else. The big exception, is you remember, is for a free trade agreement, there may be tariff-free entry of goods, as is the case, for example, if most goods come from Mexico or Korea or Canada under the various agreements, not the EU, not Japan. There is a tax for the U.S. Most of the time, it's particularly in the textile and clothing industry, it's designed to protect what's left of the U.S. industry. It's not designed to raise revenue per se. But except with regard to China, and that hasn't happened yet, it may never happen, there really hasn't been any impact on textiles and clothing.
Interesting. And how are people... So one of the things that happened is Joann's put out this call to help to... So they're going... they put out a call to just say that they needed help and support for that tariffs may be raised, and it kind of freaked out everybody, and they didn't know how to respond. And I think they're going in front of... They're trying to get an exemption at a public hearing at the Office of U.S. Trade Representatives. Can you explain what happened? Because that's why everyone started to freak out, and they didn't know they didn't know how to respond to it, and everyone kind of... The quilting group, at least one of the ones I'm in, they just really didn't know how to respond to it.
What does Joann's sell besides fabric for quilts?
They sell. They're like they sell a lot of fabric, and they sell they're like Michael's, like a craft shop. They do they're like general craft shop. Yeah.
Well, Joann's has a somewhat different set of concerns and objectives from your typical quilter, because if they're anything like what you described, they're importing a fair amount of volume of goods of one kind or another, probably including some textiles from China. And
they said in the news story, they're saying the USA Today is $200 billion. They said they said about 2/3 of the popular chain's material, which is about 900 shops, would be affected by a 25% tariff. Any question about that? Now, they haven't imposed it yet, but they're talking about it. And
those who a few months ago said, well, he really isn't going to start a trade war, and the administration is really not going to impose all these tariffs. So far, they've been wrong. So I think there is a risk. Now, basically what has happened with the earlier tariffs on, for example, aluminum and steel, is that the Commerce Department sets up an administrative process where you can seek an exemption. And by and large, what you do when you try to seek an exemption, whether it's Michael's or Walmart or anybody else, is you try to show, well, this particular product that we are importing isn't made in the U.S., so we're not hurting any domestic competitors, and there's no real likelihood somehow somebody's going to start making it, and therefore you should carve out our particular tariff line, this particular technical description, so we don't end up having to pay a 25% tariff when there isn't any alternative of buying the stuff in the United States. With the steel industry, a lot of those who have sought exemptions have faced opposition from American steel producers. Say, wait a minute, we can supply this.
Yeah. I
would guess that in the textile industry, you'll see the same thing. You will have some textile importers saying, well, nobody's really producing this material. It's not likely they could in the future. And then you'll have a few of the textile producers here in the U.S. say, wait a minute, no, we can do this. Now, for the quilting materials, it's a pretty small volume. I doubt anybody's going to do that. But you do have what essentially is an administrative process. It hasn't worked very well. It's been very slow. It's expensive if you're a small company. But by and large, in a number of cases, the Commerce Department has granted exceptions, waivers, but in the majority of cases, they haven't.
Really,
and particularly when a domestic producer, whether it's in steel or aluminum or maybe in textiles, comes in and says, no, we can sell this in the U.S., the importer is either going to have to stop importing and try to find a U.S. source, or they're going to have to pay the 25% tariff, which, of course, in most cases, they're going to pass on to whoever their customer may be, whether it's a quilting person or somebody else.
Right.
So I think the big retailers who import a lot of their goods from China, which is most of them, like Walmart or Target or any of these specialty ones that you've been talking about, are legitimately concerned that if you start imposing, and we've imposed tariffs on about $50 billion worth of Chinese products as of the final group of those was Thursday. But most of that is semiconductors and machinery and things of that sort. So far, at least, the administration has avoided affecting the textile and clothing industry. But if you're going to hit it $200 worth of imports, it's going to hit a lot of other products as well. So I think these retailers have good reason to be concerned. Whether or not the quilting group have much concern is another question, because I think probably
the smaller ones,
if they're not bringing them in from Japan, if they're bringing them from Korea, or I don't mean Japan, China, if they're bringing them from Korea or Japan, I don't think there is any foreseeable, significant risk in the foreseeable future. That doesn't mean that next year they won't decide to put high tariffs on everything from everybody.
Yeah. Now, when they go,
Congress certainly is not going to stop him. So who knows?
Yeah. So when Joann went to the USTR on Thursday, are they asking for an exemption for just them or for their category of?
It's for
goods?
their category. Pretty much, it's going to. If they exempt a particular type of fabric, for example, that comes from China, they will exempt largely on grounds that you can't get the stuff in the United States. And that's true whether it's Joann's or Walmart or anybody else.
Got it. Interesting.
So typically that's what it's done. And I don't know what kind of in these hearings, I don't know whether there is cooperation among the major importers from China. Again, Walmart, Target, and the rest, or whether each is just looking at their own area. And obviously, if you're a Walmart or a Target, you've got thousands of items.
Right.
Which might be affected because most of what's in that store came from China.
That's right.
But it sounds to me like the situation that you're most concerned about, the sources really are not primarily Chinese.
Yeah. No. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I think like all the rulers and other stuff, there might be notions, but I think the fabric in Joann's may be from China, but not in the independent quilt shop. So that's really interesting. Now, if let's say they fail. let's say they do not get the exemption, how quickly would the tariff be implemented?
In the past, there's usually been a period of 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes a little longer, after the hearing process is completed before they go ahead with the tariffs. And part of that is just to give people notice. You don't want a bunch of freighters full of, with containers coming to Los Angeles and being turned away, or somebody saying we're not going to take them because there's 25% duty. So you need to give some notice to the importers and the exporters, and you also need to give some notice to the Customs Service to be sure the computers are all set up so that they know what goods are being assessed an additional duty and what goods are not. So typically there's, I would say, at least 4 weeks notice. But what also has happened, at least with steel and aluminum, is there has been a huge rush by importers to stockpile. If they thought the tariffs were coming quickly, there were huge imports in the period just before the new tariffs apply. So if you're one of these retailers you're talking about, and they have the warehousing space, they will buy. They will put in extra orders and try to get them delivered as soon as possible. So the impact of the tariffs on the goods they're selling is delayed. You can't do it for very long, and it might delay things for a month or so.
Super interesting. Now, the other thing that occurred is that people, because we live in a highly politicized world, they didn't know really how to respond to it. Do you see it as a Republican versus Democrat kind of issue at the moment? Like, if you're a quilter and you want to be supportive of this or not, like, what does it mean exactly? And should people be thinking about it politically?
Well, typically in recent years, it's the Republican Party that has been more focused on freer trade, and the Democratic Party who has been more protectionist. To a great extent, the Trump administration has turned that on its ear, and it is politicized. I mean, look at farmers who are really getting royally screwed by this issue, because the Chinese have retaliated against U.S. tariffs by saying, well, we're not going to buy U.S. sorghum or U.S. soybeans anymore. And the price of soybeans has gone down about 30%, I think, in the last 3 or 4 months, and the whole industry is scrambling to try to find alternative sources. Some of it may go to the European Union. Who knows? And it's an interesting factor, which I suspect has a parallel with the quilting, and that is, I would say 70 to 75% of people who are farmers voted for Trump.
Yes.
And that's, you have some of them who...
Right. So, and just to say that, like, those that are shopping at Joann's and Walmart for fabric are more likely to I shop everywhere, but generally lower socioeconomics, and those would be more Trump people, I imagine, are going to be at Joann's than at the local
I think they're
shop.
much more likely to be Trump supporters than they are to be Hillary Clinton supporters, particularly if you're in certain parts of the country where I suspect that quilting is more popular, like the Midwest and the South.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think under the circumstances, there are a lot of Trump supporters who have some concern. There's a group who are basically saying, well, China's been pushing us around for a very long time. We've got to do something about this. And we hope he knows what he's doing, and we'll give him the benefit of the doubt, at least for the time being. But if you're a farmer and you got a lot of loans and you're worried about how you're going to pay them back, at some point you're going to say, well, maybe his plan really doesn't work. I mean, they had another set of negotiations this past week, and Washington got absolutely nowhere. So I think, as I said in the earlier message, if you're looking at this and saying, well, this is all very temporary, it's all going to go away in a few months, I think that's not very likely. I think it's going to be around. It could be around for years. You just don't know. And obviously for some industries, like farming and farmers who have nothing to do with steel or aluminum that are trying to export to China, and probably for anybody who's exporting goods that would be covered under this list, I don't know how many, several thousand, if they do impose an additional $200 billion of tariffs on the worth of goods, in addition to the $50 billion already, a lot of people are going to get hurt. Now, I mean, I don't know how much money the average quilt maker spends on, mostly her, materials every year. I don't know if it's a few $100 or $1,000 or what.
Yeah.
So if you add 25% to that, there's an impact. And if these are lower income people, it's a real impact. On the other hand, many of them the supporters are still very much willing to give Mr. Trump the benefit of the doubt, and I suspect that will continue, particularly among the core, for quite a long time, well into next year, I'm thinking.
So interesting.
And many of these tariff impacts, even if they go and they expand and they stay in place for a long time, are only going to be really felt on a over a period of time. If we don't get an NAFTA deal, food costs will go up in the United States. Automobile costs will go up in the United States. If they impose tariffs on autos and auto parts, a car will cost $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 more than it does today, because you can't import anything from low wage cost countries. But the U.S. economy is extremely strong. Unemployment's less than 4%. So even if businesses fail, there's a nail company in Alabama, it's probably going to close its doors because it can't afford to buy steel domestically because it can't compete with nails that are imported from somewhere else in Asia. So there will be a lot of layoffs. But in some parts of the country, that somebody gets laid off this week, he or she is going to find a job in a week or two. It's not going to be a big impact. Over time, the cost of autos and other washing machines and foodstuffs and clothing will go up. And obviously, it hits the people in, say, the lowest third of the economy, the people who save a huge amount of money compared to 20 years ago when they buy their shoes and clothing and a lot of their food at a place like Walmart. Their costs are going to go up because Walmart's going to have to raise its prices. And the same is probably true with people who are selling textiles that are made in China. But again, I don't think it affects, the only way I think it really affects the group that you're interested in is that even if the cost of their quilting doesn't go up, the cost of a lot of their other daily expenses are going to go up.
And it's a hobby.
But maybe not that much for the next 6 months or more.
Yeah, and it's a hobby. So if you don't have money for a hobby, you won't be quilting as much, even if it doesn't affect.
If it's a discretionary expense and you're spending more for food and you're spending more for shoes and clothing, you may have less to spend on quilts.
Yep, exactly. Well, this is super helpful.
And that's one reason I suspect why some of the suppliers that you're talking about, like Walmart and what's the other one?
Joanns.
One who's
Joann. Hobby Lobby.
Are worried because they figure if their base of customers is put in a position where they're having to spend more money for the necessities, for their food and their clothing and footwear and stuff like that, they're going to have less discretionary income. And if they're already people who have limited discretionary income because they're not well taken care of by our economy and our society, then it's going to get worse. So there is a big risk for the sellers.
Interesting.
And again, if you're looking at particularly if you add in some of the other things that are going on, there are going to be a lot of people over the next couple of years who are going to lose their health care or have to pay more for their health care. So if you do things to make necessities more expensive, you reduce the money that people have to put into their hobbies. And since this is a hobby, it is one which gets hit hard. I've been doing a lot of sailing and boating for many, many years. One of the sectors that gets hit very badly in a recession is those little motorboats because people buy them. They're mostly blue-collar worker in a good economy. They're making a decent living. If they get laid off or they have to go to a different job, nobody needs a small motorboat. Nobody needs a small sailboat. We like to have them, but you give them up if you have other necessities. And I think this is quilting is I assume is like a lot of other hobbies. If you are really scraping to be able to feed and clothe your family week in, week out, you're probably going to spend less on your hobbies, whatever they are.
Yeah, totally. Well, this is super helpful. As I said, I knew how I needed to call to sort through this because there was a lot of confusion and heated words and people didn't quite understand what was happening. And You know so much, and it's so much fun to hear your voice explaining trade law. Because I adored your classes, as you know, and worked for you, and I don't know, it's just awesome.
It was a good relationship. Yeah, we enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Just one more point is going back to something you mentioned before.
Yeah.
Many of those in Congress who are most supportive of the president when it comes, for example, to imposing tariffs or quotas on imported steel or aluminum are Democrats. I mean,
really?
the most protectionist people in the Senate are people like Sherrod Brown, who's running for re-election as a Democrat in Ohio, and Schumer, who's, of course, the minority leader, the Elizabeth Warrens, the Sanders, all of those who are pushing hard to get more manufacturing and more jobs in the U.S., even though some of them, I think, probably don't really understand that it's a very good idea to create, 300 or 400 or 500 new jobs in steel mills, but you may lose 10,000 jobs in companies that are steel fabricators because they can't compete with imports anymore. So it's a tough situation, but it's one of those areas which really is. There are free traders on both sides, although not many Democrats, and there are a lot of protectionists on both sides. So you can't just say, well, this,
Have you seen the Republicans?
The Trump administration.
Have you seen the Republicans? Have you seen the Republicans shifting to a more protectionist because of Trump's policies? Do you see people shifting at all, or are they staying where they were?
I don't see a lot of people shifting. I think there are a lot of traditional Republicans who tend to favor more open markets. Nobody favors free trade. It's freer trade or more open markets. Everybody wants to protect the people in your district. I think there are a lot of Republicans, particularly in the Senate, who are very, very concerned about the administration's trade policy, and some of them have vocalized this concern, but it is true of so many other areas. Republicans, by and large, don't criticize the president, period.
Interesting.
They're scared.
Yeah, they're
or
scared.
They lack backbone, whatever you want to say. But the point is, there's a lot of criticism, but at this point, there really isn't much action. But the administration has done things in a manner which, in the view of many, is very damaging to the world trading system, but under U.S. law, pretty much makes them immune from any action by the Congress. Because if you want to rein in this so-called national security exception, which is the basis for a lot of these actions, or even the intellectual property grounds against China, which is legitimate concerns about Chinese IP practices, as you know a lot better than I do. Mm-hmm. You would have to modify the trade laws, and in order to do that, if the president doesn't like it, you need 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, and that's absolutely, totally impossible. It will be totally impossible even if the Democrats manage to take over the House of Representatives. So basically, the Congress is not going to be able to restrain the president unless the president and his advisors are convinced that politically this is a really bad thing, or you cause a serious recession. But you're not going to have a recession this year, and probably not next year after all, because the overall economy in the U.S. is extremely strong. I don't think the Trump administration had a heck of a lot to do with that, other than getting the corporate tax reductions passed. But the fact is, presidents get the benefit if the economy is doing well, and they get criticized if the economy is doing badly, whether or not they are directly responsible. So at this point, the administration ought to be on a roll. They get distracted by a lot of things, as we all know. But when you've got unemployment that's below 4% in most of the country, where you've got a stock market that keeps hitting record highs, several times a week, it's the vibrancy of the economy, the strength of the economy is such that you can. I think the administration is correct in this respect. I mean, I don't like the policy, but I think it's correct in saying, well, this is a good time to be fighting with China, because we can withstand some of the pain, which there will be, as in the agricultural industry, a lot better than China can, and they may be right about that. I still don't think China will cave in, because culturally they're just not going to do it. But the fact is, if you ever want to start a trade war, it's better to do it when the U.S. economy is strong and when the U.S. economy is weak.
And what
I
do you
think
think?
Ultimately,
What do you think
Go
the
ahead.
benefit of a trade war? I mean, how are we to understand this? Is it like it's time for this to happen, or that this is just picking a fight for no good reason? For those that don't follow this and don't understand why this is happening, sort of how are we to understand this?
I think it's somewhere in between. I think if you were to look specifically at Chinese practices with regard to intellectual property, stealing American intellectual property, forcing American companies to divulge intellectual property as a condition of doing business in China, a lot of the hacking, the administration has very legitimate concerns. I think in retrospect, Obama, Bush have been much too soft. We're much too soft on these issues, which have been festering at least for the last 15 years or more. So at some point, I think one can reasonably say it's time to stand up to China and try to do something about this, because if we don't, their made in China 2025 policy, they will completely overwhelm us. So I think in that respect, dealing with intellectual property violations is probably a good idea. I think the other problem is just, pure protectionism. We're going to have everything sold in the United States is going to be made in the United States. Well, that's not going to happen. You can get more if you make it impossible to import auto parts and steel and aluminum. Everything made in the U.S. from any of those any of those sectors is going to get more expensive, and people will be able to buy.
We can keep watching it. We now have a better sense of what exactly is happening. And we will. How will we know if will they announce it? How will we know if anything? How do people find out what happened with these exemptions?
Well, at least in the national press and the Times and the Washington Post and the trade print, it's all very well publicized. I mean, if by some chance the Chinese and the U.S. agree to settle all of this, it will be front page news. If they agree to move forward with an additional $200 billion worth of tariffs on China, it will be thoroughly reported in national and regional newspapers. So it will not be done.
It will not be quiet. Got it. Okay, well, we will keep watching the news to see what happens. But you helped us in huge ways today, and I really appreciate it. I'm going to turn off the recording. Anything else that we need to know before I turn off things? We're good?
No, but I think you can assume that this is going to be a medium or a long-term process. I don't see any suggestion that the administration is uneasy about what's happening. They've got a strong U.S. economy to give them time to try to deal with these issues. If there's any question, I think it is we all wonder whether they really have an overall policy that is going to resolve these issues, or they're just going from one problem to another. But I think it's too soon to say one way or the other whether that is really the flaw in the system. So we will see.
Should we be stockpiling fabric before the prices go up at Joann's and Walmart and Hobby Lobby?
I think if you are importing fabric from China, you will be wise to stockpile whatever you can to.
And what about the consumer?
The warehouse.
Yeah.
I think from Japan and Korea, the risks are extremely low.
Yeah. But what about the consumer? Like, should we be buying extra yards of fabric just in case prices go up, or do you think that's too irrational?
I think it's unlikely. I suspect that the Walmarts and the other retailers are not going to do anything to discourage their customers from buying stuff. So I don't really think stockpiling makes a lot of sense unless you just like to have a lot of additional fabric around, which I'm sure some people do, so they can decide what they're going to make this week. But I don't think these risks are particularly, again, from Korea and Japan. I don't think these risks are at all significant.
Fabulous. All right, cool. Hold on. Don't hang up. I'm just going to turn off the recording. Thanks again. I really appreciate it.
All right. Nice to talk to you, Liz.
So this is Elizabeth Townsend Guard. You've been listening to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School. We want to hear from you. Join our army, our quilting army. Go to our Facebook page. Suggest people